Hey everyone, Lori Spencer here. Welcome back to this History Book Club reading of The Kennedys After Camelot by New York Times bestselling author J. Randy Taraborelli. Please take a moment to like this video and share that playlist link, which is down in the comments section, with anyone you think might enjoy this Kennedy Family Book Club so that they can listen to every episode back to back. And if you'd like to support my efforts with a donation, check out my wish list at giftapp.com/real-Lori-Spencer, where you can select a book that you'd like me to consider for a future book club reading. There are lots of great Kennedy family history books on my wish list for you to choose from. So, today, in episode 2, we will be learning the story of two Kennedy sisters. The tragic secret sister, Rosemary, who suffered from mental illness and was infamously lobotomized at the age of 23 by her father, Joseph P. Kennedy, and we'll also talk about Eunice Kennedy Shriver, who founded the Special Olympics, Best Buddies, and, along with her husband, Sergeant Shriver, the Head Start program, as a way to help people like her sister Rosemary. I've selected this particular chapter from After Camelot to read and discuss today because, well, it's actually very timely, given the headlines of the moment, and there's a Kennedy connection. President Trump's Health and Human Services Secretary is, of course, Robert F. Kennedy Jr. This week, the Associated Press reported that as part of Secretary Kennedy's proposed budget cuts at HHS, the 60-year-old Head Start program, which was such an important part of the legacy his Aunt Eunice Kennedy Shriver and his uncle, Sergeant Shriver, established back during the Johnson administration for low-income families and children with disabilities, that program is at risk of being shut down forever as part of the DOGE cuts. Also, this past week, RFK Jr. again sparked outrage with some comments he made about autism at his first press conference as HHS Secretary.
Robert F. Kennedy Jr. pushed misinformation about autism long before President Trump named Kennedy to lead Americans' health policy. This week, Kennedy said that autism destroys lives. He painted a bleak picture of a life lived with autism, and he claimed, against the scientific evidence, that autism is preventable. You know who was listening when he said that? People with autism and those who love them. Our Spencer Soisher spoke with a few.
That neon in the window will tell you this house is closed on Fridays.
We're closed today, actually, so the open sign is off today.
Jennifer Korb still opened the doors to tell us her story about raising her son Hayden, who has autism.
Right now, his special interest is open signs. So we are the proud owners of, I think, 8 open signs. But it's one of the things that makes him unique and beautiful.
It's those qualities that makes her worried by the comments from Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr.
Autism destroys families.
To narrow the focus to one kind of outcome is so limiting. Autism is a spectrum, and every family's experience with autism is different.
In his first news conference since assuming his new role, Kennedy called autism an epidemic caused by environmental factors. He discounted his own department scientists who say that genetics are the strongest contributing factor.
These are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball.
I certainly pay taxes.
Daisy Montgomery is no baseball player, but she is autistic and runs her own business.
A lot of autistics are given up on at such an early age that they're not taught business skills. How do you make a resume? How do you interview?
As Kennedy highlights rising cases, the CDC points out more cases likely means better screening and diagnoses, like Daisy's diagnosis at an older age. And she wonders if Kennedy's comments erase decades of progress and understanding of the spectrum of the disorder.
If you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism.
Parents are afraid, because of RFK Jr.'s comments, that if they have their child identified as autistic, that it will be a black mark on them for the rest of their lives.
Kennedy says the government will have a cure for autism by September. He continues to insist that vaccines or environmental factors are the reason for the increased diagnoses. That despite loads of research debunking the link.
So this idea of saying that autism is preventable, saying that he's going to real quick determine what it is, you get exactly what they're saying about how this is going to start to become blamed on parents. Well, it's like, well, I told you it was that factor, and your kid still ended up with autism, so shame on you. This could get really ugly really fast.
Right, and the person leading this trial, the person that he's tapped to lead this, is a guy from Maryland without a medical license. He was practicing there. He's also published papers already claiming that vaccines cause autism.
This is the guy he put in charge of it?
Yes.
All right, Spencer Soisher, thank you.
Kennedy's comments obviously sparked a lot of backlash, and then a couple of days later, he held another press conference on Friday in which he announced an autism registry, and that set off yet another firestorm of outrage and panic and confusion. Obviously, there's a lot of questions about that, and I'm going to show you a brief report in case you missed the story, what that's all about.
Health Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. launching a disease registry to track Americans with autism. It comes after he announced plans to launch studies to determine the environmental toxins that he says are to blame for the developmental disorders. Some doctors say the health secretary has already come to a predetermined conclusion instead of letting research do the talking.
This is a preventable disease. We know it's an environmental exposure. It has to be. Genes do not cause epidemics. They can provide a vulnerability. You need an environmental toxin.
Tuesday, the CDC releasing a study finding 1 in 31 children fall somewhere on the autism spectrum. We've got a child and adolescent psychiatrist, Dr. Daniel Bover, joining us now. Good to see you, doctor. The community is really mixed on what the Secretary of Health has said. Where do you stand on this, and what do we know so far as to this plan?
Well, listen, there definitely is a genetic basis for autistic spectrum disorder. Are there toxins in the environment that may activate certain genes, what we call epigenetics, at work here? It's possible, and it's something that needs to be studied. I'm all for studying the problem. But the problem is when you start creating disease registries, it's kind of on the cusp of Holocaust Remembrance Day in Israel, and we know there was a group of people that wanted to keep registries of people with disabilities. So that's very frightening to a lot of people. And what we don't need is a climate of prejudice, of fear, of stigma. We need to do research, but we need to do it in a nuanced way that respects people's privacy.
What do we know about autism? Because I think therein lies the issue, right? That not so much is known, and it runs the gamut. It really isn't like, it doesn't just present in one specific way.
So a lot of people with autistic spectrum disorder are highly functional members of society. There are doctors that I work with. I even happen to know someone who happens to be the wealthiest person of the world, in the world, who's been diagnosed with autistic spectrum disorder, and he admits that he has it. So there's varying levels of functionality. Some are very disabled and some need assistance, but some are very, very productive members of society.
Do you foresee this plan, this registry, if you will, really following, completing itself, if you will? I mean, are people going to register for this? Are they going to be registered unwillingly? How is this going to work?
Well, you know, there is some precedent for this. There are other states that have disease registries, certainly. But I think it should be voluntary. I think people should have the right to opt out. I think the results, or the records rather, have to be de-identified so that people aren't followed in terms of who they are personally. So I think we have to really look at this in a way that respects people's privacy.
All right, Doctor, we appreciate it, and certainly something that we should continue to talk about, especially it is now back in the forefront, given the comments there from the Secretary. Thank you again for coming on the DMV Zone.
Absolutely. My pleasure.
RFK Jr. said, quote, "These are kids who will never pay taxes. They'll never hold a job. They'll never play baseball. They'll never write a poem. They'll never go out on a date. Many of them will never use a toilet unassisted. And we have to recognize that we are doing this to our children." When RFK Jr. said those words, it sounded to me, as a Kennedy historian, like he was describing his Aunt Rosemary. Many autism advocates are saying that RFK Jr.'s comments echo the eugenicists of a century ago. And as you'll hear in this chapter today, Rosemary Kennedy had several traits that might put her on the autism spectrum. But of course, no such diagnosis existed in her time. The clinical diagnosis of autism wasn't invented until 1943. That's 2 years after Rosemary was lobotomized. Prior to her operation, Rosemary's disability might be considered a mild form of autism, but after the lobotomy, Rosemary had the intellectual capacity of a 6-year-old child. She was unable to care for herself. She needed constant supervision for the rest of her years, which were spent in an institution and kept a secret from the public for decades. The stigma of what was then called mental retardation caused families, especially families like the Kennedys, to lock their loved ones away in state hospitals and never speak of them or acknowledge them publicly, or worse, entrust them to quack doctors who were always promising some new miracle cure for their unfortunate condition. The so-called science of eugenics movement was very fashionable and popular amongst the elite. In the 1930s, 40s, and 50s, the latest trend in medical science was a brain operation called a prefrontal lobotomy. And Dr. Walter Freeman was considered the go-to expert in the field. It was Dr. Freeman whom Ambassador Joe Kennedy sought out to hopefully fix the broken brain of his beloved daughter Rosemary with this newfangled surgical procedure. But as you'll hear in today's episode, that turned out to be an absolute disaster, ruining Rosemary's life and haunting Joe Kennedy for the rest of his. So let's dive back into this book. If you're reading along with me in the hardcover edition of After Camelot, we're jumping in today on page 32, Eunice Kennedy Shriver. Taking a bird's eye view of the Kennedy clan, 4 sons, 5 daughters, Eunice Shriver, with her barely suppressed nervous energy, her gangly and sometimes rather androgynous appearance, and her predilection for long black cigars and man-tailored slacks, seemed to have had more in common with her brothers than her sisters. Indeed, hers would be a service-driven life, fueled by the kind of commitment more in keeping with her male siblings than with her sisters. Even in her choice of husband, Eunice seemed to be guided by instincts that were quite at odds with her sisters, in that Sergeant Shriver matched Eunice in intelligence, in ambition, and in a passionate desire to be of service to his country. He was also a devout Roman Catholic, as are all the Kennedys. Born on July 10, 1921, in Brookline, Massachusetts, the 5th of 9 Kennedy children, Eunice graduated from Manhattanville, a Catholic college in Purchase, New York, after attending a series of exclusive Catholic boarding schools. True to her spirit of individualism, she chose to go to Stanford University rather than the Ivy League of her siblings, graduating with a B.S. in sociology in 1943. The choice of degree affirmed her commitment to social work. After a short time working in the Special War Problems Division in the U.S. State Department, she moved on to the Justice Department as executive secretary for a project dealing with juvenile delinquency, a job that led to a position as staff social worker for the Federal Independent Institute for Women. She accepted an offer in Chicago to join the House of the Good Shepherd Women's Shelter and the Juvenile Court. It was a fateful move in that it was here that she became reacquainted with her future husband, Sergeant Shriver, whom she had first met back in 1946 at a Manhattan cocktail party. She and Sarge married in 1954. Over the next 11 years, they would have 5 children: Sarge III, also known by his middle name, Bobby, Maria Shriver, Timothy, Mark, and Anthony. As a mother, Eunice could of course be loving and caring. But she was also her own mother's daughter, and as such, she could sometimes appear to be emotionally removed. Quote, if the Shriver children wanted affection and understanding, they generally went to Sargent, just as the Kennedy children had gone to Joseph, not Rose, observed the journalist Helen Thomas. This isn't to say that Eunice wasn't a loving mother. She enjoyed nothing more than nurturing her children and gave each of them the one thing she knew that they needed most, the freedom to choose. She supported their decisions pretty much always, after great discussion, of course. Though her 5 children, Bobby, Maria, Timothy, Mark, and Anthony, knew that she loved them, she was a woman of action, not necessarily sentiment, Helen Thomas added. Quote, she was not a patient person. She didn't suffer fools. Her kids knew to toe the line. If they wanted to be coddled, that's what Sarge is for. If they wanted direction, if they wanted motivation, if they wanted a good shove in the right direction, that was Eunice's place. She wasn't exactly like any other mother you'd ever seen. That's what Maria Shriver would say of her mother in her touching eulogy of Eunice Kennedy Shriver at her funeral in August of 2009. Quote, as a young girl, I didn't actually know how to process her appearance much of the time because most of the mothers were dressed up and neatly coiffed. Mummy wore men's pants. She smoked Cuban cigars, and she played tackle football. She would come to pick us all up at school in her blue Lincoln convertible. Her hair would be flying in the wind. There would usually be some pencils or pens in it. The car would be filled with all these boys and their friends and their animals. She'd have on a cashmere sweater with little notes pinned to it to remind her of what she needed to do when she got home. And more often than not, the sweater would be covering a bathing suit so that she could lose no time jumping into the pool to beat us all in a water polo game. Needless to say, when the nuns would announce her arrival, I would try to run for cover. There was rarely a quiet day for Eunice and Sarge or their children, who were constantly engulfed by the productive chaos and vibrant energy of their parents. We were taught to make the most of every day, Maria Shriver recalled. Our parents never wasted a single second. Yes, it was exhausting, but they had a love of life and a passion to serve. It just infused everything they did, and in turn, everything we did too. You will, you must, you can, they would tell us. In their marriage, the Shrivers provided a great balance for one another. Sargent was level-headed and grounded, whereas Eunice could sometimes be scatterbrained, brimming with nervous energy. Though he had many important responsibilities, he was organized and structured and had the ability to focus on one project at a time, give it his all, and then move on to the day's next task. Eunice, though, always had at least 10 projects going at the same time. Some of them got finished, some of them didn't. "Oh my God," she would exclaim as she raced from one appointment to the next. "I'm going to be late." There just weren't enough hours in the day for Eunice. Whereas Sarge might be followed by 2 officious-looking male assistants taking careful notes and helping him organize his day, the journalist Hugh Sidey from Time magazine recalled, quote, Eunice usually had a half-dozen women at her beck and call. They were all equally frazzled, with notebooks overflowing with charts and graphs, asking questions, taking orders, and shadowing her every move. Despite often being ill with the effects of Addison's disease, which also plagued her brother Jack, as well as stomach ulcers and colitis, Eunice still managed to keep an extraordinarily busy schedule. She rarely complained, and thus the bar was raised for her kids in how much illness they should be able to tolerate. For instance, they were never allowed to stay home from school when they had a cold or other childhood maladies. "Get to school, and I don't want to hear another yip about it," she would tell them. That Eunice and Sergeant Shriver seemed to have a happy marriage for so many years, 55 years in all, suggests that the couple had found a way to navigate the often rocky terrain that had to have gone along with Eunice's split loyalties between her family and her husband. That said, as much as he was an acolyte of the Kennedys, Sergeant Shriver always sought to maintain his and his family's own identity. A famous story has it that his son Bobby had hurt himself while playing, and though he wanted to cry, he didn't because, as everyone knew, Kennedys don't cry. Sergeant Shriver told him, "It's okay. You can cry. You're a Shriver." Bobby Shriver recalled of his father, "He didn't want us always to do exactly what the Kennedys did." Indeed, Bobby, like his father and brother Timothy, went to Yale, not Harvard, the traditional Kennedy college. When asked what it felt like to be Kennedys, the Shriver children would almost always answer, "Shrivers are not Kennedys." Also vitally important to Eunice and Sarge was their Catholicism. They were very devout. They went to Mass almost every day, says Timothy. He recalls their home being, quote, layered with crucifixes and Madonnas and other very Catholic sort of statuary. It was not congregational and stark, it was just Catholic. Besides their sharing a deep faith, not a lot was known about the personal relationship between Eunice and Sargent. They were both very private. If they fought, it was never in front of other people. They were rarely demonstrative in front of others. Occasionally, though, something would slip that would give the others a bit of a peek as to what their marriage might be like behind closed doors. For instance, in the early 1970s, during the height of the popularity of his talk show, Phil Donahue aired a program focusing on female vulnerability. The topic sparked a conversation at an all-girls luncheon between Eunice, Jackie, Jean Kennedy, and a few of their friends, including Joan Braden. The question posed was, when are you most vulnerable? Jackie said, "My answer would have to be when I'm with Ari," referring to her husband, Aristotle Onassis. She says, "I think that's when I'm the most vulnerable." "Definitely, when a woman is with her husband," Jean Kennedy said. "That's when she lets down all of her defenses, isn't it?" Joan Braden agreed. Eunice, though, just sat silently. "So what would you say, Eunice?" Joan Kennedy asked. "I don't even understand the question," Eunice said, shrugging. She added that, in her opinion, vulnerability suggested weakness. "And I am never weak," she concluded, "so I don't know what to tell you." The other women just smiled. That was Eunice. Flashback to July 1964. "It's amazing, isn't it?" Eunice Kennedy Shriver asked Jackie Kennedy as the two women walked through the park-like grounds of the property known as Timberlawn. It was a sunny Saturday morning, and Jackie, Jean Kennedy, and an assortment of Kennedy family members and friends had gathered at the sprawling estate of Eunice and Sergeant Shriver for the weekend to plan a benefit intended to raise money for one of Eunice's pet projects, Camp Shriver. The Shrivers had moved to Timberlawn back in 1961, a bucolic 30-acre estate just outside Bethesda, Maryland. Ethel and Bobby had Hickory Hill, and you and Sarge have Timberlawn, Joan Braden noted with a smile, according to her memory of that day. Jackie had to laugh. "Well, I don't think even Ethel could handle all of this," she said. Indeed, the project Eunice called Camp Shriver was a lot to take in. As the small group of women walked along one of Timberlawn's well-manicured pathways, they passed a tennis court where Shriver children, Maria, Timothy, and Bobby, and Jackie's children, John and Caroline, were playfully hitting balls around with a half-dozen other youngsters. Eunice had personally talked to the Shriver and Kennedy offspring to explain to them why it was important that they interact with children less fortunate. Timothy, who was just 3 when the camp began, was paired with a mentally handicapped boy named Wendell. They became inseparable, playing all day long and even getting into some mischief together. Nearby, a group of 24 apparently handicapped children and teenagers were busy doing calisthenics out on one of the lawns. Some of their teachers were inmates from Lorton Reformatory in Fairfax County, Virginia, recruited by Eunice to instruct at Camp Shriver as part of a work furlough program. In the distance could be seen a large Olympic-sized swimming pool where special needs children were learning to swim under the watchful eye of Catholic school teachers from Sacred Heart School, Stone Ridge in Bethesda. Eunice had somehow convinced them to also volunteer. Continuing down the path, the small group soon came to a stable where another gaggle of children were learning to ride horses. Their teachers, diplomats from the British Embassy, whom Eunice had heard were excellent equestrians and whom she charmed into volunteering. There were, in all, 26 volunteer counselors at Camp Shriver and 34 children. Jackie Kennedy looked around wondrously and asked, "How in the world do you do it? How do you get all these people to volunteer? It's just amazing." Jean Kennedy answered the question. "You know how Eunice is. If she wants you to do something for her," she said to Jackie, "she won't take no for an answer. She will pester you until you will either go mad or you'll do what she asks." The women could only look at Eunice with admiration. It all started back in the spring of 1962 when a woman from Bethesda contacted Eunice as a last resort to ask her if she knew of any summer camp that her child, who was mentally retarded, might attend. It was an interesting question, and when Eunice looked into it, she found that there was no such camp anywhere in the United States. But how could that be possible, she wondered. In the 1950s, those suffering from mental retardation were very often viewed as hopeless individuals who should be locked away, hidden from sight, never to be thought of again. There was nothing that could be done for them, it was thought by many, and so it was therefore better to not have to think about them at all. Not only did society not know what to make of the mentally retarded, but parents who'd had the misfortune of giving birth to such children were also often shunned and ridiculed. Therefore, some parents did everything they could think of to keep the child's problems a secret. Those who did their best to raise their mentally handicapped child at home found it extremely difficult. These problems would often ruin their lives, causing them to become socially ostracized and even to turn against each other as pressures and anxieties contaminated their marriages. More than that, it was almost impossible to find doctors who wanted to care for the mentally retarded. Generally, those in the medical profession only wished to treat patients they could cure, and so it was thought that there was nothing that could be done for those suffering from mental retardation, so why bother? It seems impossible to imagine today, but back in the 1950s and before, the parents of mentally retarded children often felt forced to make that heartbreaking decision to lock their sons and daughters away in horrible, unsanitary mental asylums, and then tell family and friends that the child had died. In fact, most doctors very strongly suggested this drastic course of action. It was thought that the inevitable fate of the child would be to spend their life in an institution anyway, so better that it should happen immediately rather than later, when emotional bonds would be that much more difficult to break. If the child then eventually did pass away in the institution, the parents would then sometimes bury him or her in an unmarked grave and do their best to forget their child. Just as Eunice was mulling over that first telephone call she received, inquiring about a camp for the mentally retarded, another mother contacted her with the same question. To Eunice, it felt like a sign. Enough, she decided. She sat down with Sargent, and according to what he would later recall, she said in typical Eunice fashion, "There's a need here, and we have to fill it, Sarge." Fine, but where? Sargent asked. We'll have to lease some space, I suppose. Maybe a park? No, Eunice said. I want to do it here. We have plenty of room here, Sarge. But here? In our home? Sargent said, just a little flabbergasted. Well, you know what they say, Eunice concluded. Charity begins at home. Sargent had to laugh. I know that's what they say, he told his wife, but I'm not sure they meant quite like this. Now she was on a mission, and Eunice Kennedy Shriver loved nothing more than the challenge of a good mission. She started by contacting hospitals and schools, asking them for the names of special needs students who might benefit from a summer camp. Then she recruited counselors, at first just students from local high schools and colleges. Once she put them all together in her home, she gave birth to what she called Camp Shriver. It all sounds a little unusual, but if one considers the way Eunice Kennedy was raised, it's really not. Quote, during summers in Hyannisport when she was young, she and her siblings would all be expected by their father, Joseph, to report to the beach at 7 a.m. and stand in single file like little soldiers, recalled Sancy Newman, a neighbor of the Kennedys in Hyannisport. She continues, then, at their father's behest, they would compete with one another in sports activities, interspersed with vigorous calisthenics. Joseph would then split them up into teams, and the winning team that day would have his approval, while those on the other team were often shunned as losers for the rest of the day, not just by Joseph, but by the kids on the winning team. We were taught that coming in second place was not acceptable, Eunice once told me. We competed in everything, against each other. Whether we were racing, sailing, playing football, we each felt quite strongly that we had to win. The ethos of intense competition was handed down from Joe to his sons, especially to Bobby. His daughter, Kathleen, recalled in an interview with McCall's, quote, we had to be first in sailing and skiing races. We had to beat our opponents in tennis and get more runs than the other team in softball. And if we didn't, he'd get mad. Very, very mad. It was made clear that we weren't to take these sports half-heartedly. And to make sure we were in condition for athletics, Father had the Green Berets set up an obstacle course on the grounds. Can you believe it? The Green Berets. We climbed ropes, we jumped, we ran, swung, and we toughened up all right. Sergeant Shriver once said of his wife, quote, I had never heard of a woman so absolutely hell-bent on beating a man at every sport, no matter what it was. Why, she would find a way to turn recreational horseback riding into a deadly competition. I used to think, what is wrong with her? Then I got it. She's a Kennedy. Given the strong history of competition fostered in the Kennedy family, perhaps for Eunice to consider hosting athletic events in her own backyard wasn't that much of a stretch. She also firmly believed that physical fitness was vitally important to the well-being of the mentally retarded. For instance, she questioned why so many mentally retarded people seemed out of shape and overweight. Was it because of their mental and emotional limitations? Or was it because they had no venue for exercise, no opportunity to be physically fit? Addressing these kinds of issues would, of course, present the catalyst for the creation of the Special Olympics, arguably Eunice's most important contribution to society and to history. Camp Shriver opened its doors on June 7, 1962, attended mainly by children from the Gales Child Health Center in Washington, D.C. It ended in early July, so that Eunice and Sarge could spend the rest of the summer at the Kennedy compound with their kids. It would continue like that with that schedule for years to come. Half the time, Timber Lawn would be filled with the most brilliant minds of the century, Maria Shriver added. And the other half of the time, it would be filled by people banging their heads into trees. There would be 100 Peace Corps volunteers and 100 retarded children there at the same time. I look back at it sometimes and I think to myself, I can't believe I survived that. Sergeant Shriver once recalled, quote, "When I'd come home from the office, there's my wife in the pool holding this mentally retarded child in the water to see if it's possible for that child to swim. She didn't hire somebody for that. She's a hands-on person. She went into that goddamn pool herself." Maria Shriver laughs at the memory. "That was Mummy," she said, "hands-on all the way." 5 years later, in July 1968, that's 1 month after the assassination of her brother Bobby, Eunice realized what would become her life's work, the Special Olympics. The announcement would be made in conjunction with the opening ceremonies of the very first Special Olympics being held in Chicago. Starting on a small scale with some 1,000 athletes from across the United States and Canada participating, it would eventually grow internationally, with more than 3 million athletes from more than 150 countries participating throughout the world. "Let me win" was, as Eunice pointed out, the athlete's oath. But if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt. 3 years after the Special Olympics inaugural games in Chicago, the U.S. Olympic Committee gave the Special Olympics official approval to use the name Olympics. 6 years later, in 1977, the first International Special Olympics Winter Games were held in February in Steamboat Springs, Colorado. In 1988, the Special Olympics were officially recognized by the International Olympic Committee. In 1997, Healthy Athletes became an official Special Olympics initiative, offering health information and screenings to Special Olympics athletes worldwide. From a physical education teacher's hopeful idea and a powerful woman's remarkable vision and family resources, the small acorn was planted and is now a giant oak in the form of the International Special Olympics, with every indication that it will continue to grow to even greater heights. What happened to Rosemary Kennedy? Eunice Kennedy Shriver's lifelong work to advance the public's understanding of mental retardation and erase the dreadful stigma that had once been attached to it is today the stuff of legend. The Kennedys more than just understood the pain and tragedy people faced in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s when it came to having a mentally retarded person in the family. In fact, they'd experienced it. Rosemary Kennedy, commonly known by the family as Rosemary, or Rosie, was the third child born to Rose and Joseph Kennedy on September 13, 1918. As a baby, she seemed normal. As she grew older, though, she began to experience certain learning and behavioral difficulties. However, it was thought at the time that she just had a low IQ, or at least that's what doctors at first told Joseph and Rose. For many years, Rosemary would happily participate in the family's many social functions. She was a good athlete. She swam and played tennis and was full of life and beloved by her brothers and sisters as each was born and began to thrive within the family. However, from all accounts, she was also a bit slow and could be moody, though apparently everyone recognized, understood, and accepted her limitations. Rose would later say that her daughter also had a tendency to mix up her letters when she was writing, which would perhaps suggest that she was dyslexic. As an adult, Rosemary called Rose's secretary Barbara "Arbarb," hinting at such a condition. Suggesting that there wasn't a great deal of alarm about Rosemary's condition is that when she was 19 and Eunice was 16, the two went to Switzerland together without a chaperone. In a family where the mandate was always that the older children take care of the younger, it seems fairly obvious that if Rose trusted Rosemary to be responsible for her own younger sister, she must have felt that the young woman could handle it. Over the years, a great deal of mythology has been created and then disseminated as fact regarding what happened to Rosemary, and much of it is impossible to interpret because of the passing of so many years, observed the noted author Gore Vidal. Vidal had a long and sometimes contentious relationship with the Kennedys. His mother had married a man who was later Jackie's stepfather. Quote, certain doctors supposedly suggested that Rosemary should be institutionalized. However, he said, according to family legend, Joseph supposedly wouldn't hear of it. What can they do for her there that we can't do for her here? He had purportedly asked. Rose wholeheartedly agreed, or so the story goes. In fact, it does seem to be true that Rose Kennedy, by her own admission, worked diligently to keep her daughter well-read, educated, and able to traffic in the Kennedys' fast-paced world. It appears, at least based on Rose's memoir, Times to Remember, that she wanted Rosemary to fit in with the rest of her brothers and sisters, and that Rosemary did just that. For a while, anyway. It is agreed by all parties that things took a dramatic turn when Rosemary was about 20. Though no one seemed to understand why, the young woman's condition began to worsen, and from some accounts, she had become argumentative and even violent. It was thought that she had become frustrated that she couldn't keep up with all of her ambitious and competitive siblings as they began to evolve emotionally and physically. As a result, it was posited, she had begun to resent them, and many of her other relatives as well. When she had a physical altercation with her paternal grandfather, that would be former Boston Mayor Honey Fitzgerald, by the way, Rose and Joseph supposedly realized they had a problem on their hands, and they were unequipped to solve it. Mother took Rosemary to any number of doctors, Eunice Kennedy Shriver would recall many years later. It was always the same. Put her away. Lock her up. The family is too competitive. She will never find a place. Of course, families had been told this for generations. Is this true or not? Since it came from Eunice, one has to assume that it is likely true, or that, at the very least, it's what Eunice was told. Eventually, the Kennedys apparently sent Rosemary to a Catholic boarding school, a decision that did little to rectify the situation, recalled Sancy Newman, who knew Rosemary very well as a youngster. Unhappy with the sense of confinement, Rosemary supposedly took to sneaking out at night, spending evenings away, and it was feared maybe being sexually active as well. What if she were raped? What if she became pregnant? As the legend that's been handed down to the family members has it, fears for Rosemary's safety began to mount, and along with them, Joseph's reservations. Looking back on it now, all these years later, it seems clear that she had some kind of psychotic break that today would probably have been treated with drugs. Who knows? Perhaps she became bipolar or was suffering from depression. But retarded? No, I never thought she was retarded. That's what Sancy Newman, Rosemary's friend and neighbor, had to say about it. Though there are still questions as to what really was going on with her, Rosemary Kennedy was beginning to present a big problem to the family, and as Joseph Kennedy saw it, one that might even have the potential to interfere with the Kennedys' social status and political ambitions. Of course, most people would view Joseph Kennedy as cold-hearted in this regard, others as downright cruel. However, one thing was also true about him. He was practical, a man of action, who prided himself on his ability to look at a problem with clear-eyed, unsparing vision and then take care of it expeditiously. Indeed, Kennedy did decide to take matters into his own hands where his daughter Rosemary was concerned, and the stunning decision he would make about her in 1941 would yield results nothing short of disastrous. Lobotomy. In the late 1930s and early 1940s, a new surgical procedure called a lobotomy was being developed in the United States, ostensibly to treat serious emotional problems such as schizophrenia and severe depression. Its success in extreme cases was being trumpeted in some medical circles, though most conventional wisdom at the time viewed the surgery as being extremely risky. We now know that the frontal lobes of the brain are involved in motor function, problem solving, spontaneity, memory, language, initiation, judgment, impulse control, and social and sexual behavior. In a sense, it could be said that the frontal lobes are also responsible for a person's imagination, for the part of one's personality that inspires desire and ambitions for the future. It was reasoned back in the 1930s and 40s that a possible explanation for violence and anger in the personalities of some mentally disturbed people sprang from a sense of extreme frustration that their dreams and aspirations could never actually manifest due to their handicapped nature. Therefore, it was posited, if the frontal lobe of a person's brain were compromised, and thus the part of the brain that creates hope and motivation also became impaired, certain behavior problems could be eradicated as well. How? Because the patient would then have no unrealistic notions about what he or she could achieve and would blend into society in as well-adjusted a manner as possible. Today, the notion of destroying a vital part of a person's brain sounds barbaric. It's difficult to imagine that once upon a time, there were doctors who actually specialized in this field. But in fact, there were quite a few in the 1940s. This part's difficult to read, and it should probably come with a warning. If you have small children in the room, you might not want to play this part for them. During a lobotomy operation, an ice pick-like device, in some cases an actual gold-plated ice pick, or a device resembling a blunt knife, was actually inserted under a patient's eyelid and above the tear duct, then hammered into the brain through the thin bone of the eye socket. With that instrument firmly in place, the doctor then simply swished it about, thereby destroying the brain's frontal lobes. Unfortunately, there were no cameras or other kinds of monitoring devices at that time to determine what was actually happening in or to the patient's brain. Instead, the patient was simply put under a local anesthetic, and as the doctor slowly did his work, they were asked certain questions. When the answers became vague and the patient seemed more distant and detached than previously, the operation was considered over and successful. It's horrifying, yet true. In 1941, Joseph Kennedy consulted with some of the more avant-garde doctors of the time, who told him that a lobotomy was a new and exciting solution to an old problem of mental illness. Other doctors disagreed, and vehemently so. When Joseph eventually discussed the operation with Rose, she asked her daughter Kathleen to look into it. Kathleen came back and told her mother that it was most certainly not the way to go where Rosemary was concerned. It was by no means a solution to mental retardation and was only used on patients with severe psychiatric or emotional illnesses that could otherwise not be treated. And even then, it was far from widely accepted. Only about 60 of these operations had been performed up until that time, and with mixed results. Most of the patients were severely brain damaged, though. There was no getting around it. Rose was satisfied to hear as much, and she told Joseph but what Kathleen had learned. And as far as she was concerned, the case was closed. For Joseph Kennedy, though, it wasn't closed at all. While Rose was out of town, Joseph Kennedy took it upon himself to take his daughter to a hospital to have the terrible operation performed on her, apparently without telling a single person in his family about it. In Rosemary's case, rather than go through the eye as usual, doctors drilled right through the top of her skull. One doctor then inserted the surgical instrument and moved it around, destroying brain matter in the process. Meanwhile, another doctor asked her certain questions. Could she recite certain prayers, sing certain songs, count backwards from 10? They made an estimate about how far to continue the swishing based on how she responded to the questions. Finally, when Rosemary couldn't make sense of the questions anymore, it was decided that the operation was over. Afterward, everyone agreed that it hadn't gone very well. Maybe not surprisingly, Rosemary Kennedy came out of this surgery completely retarded, with virtually no sign of her former personality left in her. She could barely speak and was, for all intents and purposes, perhaps no more than 5 years old in her mind. Her head was tilted. She was incontinent, severely brain damaged, and could no longer speak or reason. At just 23 years of age, her life was all but ruined. I just want to pause here before we continue and show you a very brief and rare piece of film footage of Rosemary Kennedy. There aren't very many of her speaking prior to this operation, so that you can at least get some idea of what she was like before the lobotomy. So I'm going to show you a brief clip from one of their trips to England. This is in 1938, when Joseph Kennedy was ambassador to the court of St. James, ambassador to England under FDR. And he would bring his kids over there, to show them off to the press, his big, beautiful family. And Rosemary went along on those trips. So in this video, you'll get to hear her speak very, very briefly.
Why, Rosie?
Seems like a pretty normal young lady to me. Probably to you too. Okay, back to the book. By some accounts, Joseph Kennedy was horrified by what had happened to his daughter. By other accounts, he was, if not wholly pleased, at least somewhat satisfied. Rosemary was at first hospitalized, but then Joseph shipped her off to an institution where she would spend the next 7 years. When Rose returned home from her trip, Joseph told her and the rest of the family that while she was gone, he had taken Rosemary in for a doctor's examination, said their neighbor and friend, Sancy Newman. It was decided then and there, or so Joseph had lied anyway, that it was no longer possible for the family to care for her at home. He maintained that Rosemary, like thousands of others at the time, had to be just locked away, and that was the end of it, unquote. One can only wonder about the psychological impact such an event may have had on the Kennedy siblings. After all, one day they had a sister, and the next day they didn't. Once, Ted Kennedy's longtime friend and former Harvard classmate, the writer Burton Hirsch, asked him what he as a youngster thought when his sister Rosemary just suddenly disappeared from sight one day. Teddy mulled the question over for a moment before answering. "I thought that I'd better do what Dad wanted, or the same thing might happen to me." New information now reveals that Rose Kennedy and some of her children began visiting Rosemary in 1949. That's 8 years after she was committed. Apparently, the private institution in which Rosemary had first been ensconced was no place Joseph wanted his wife and older siblings to visit. Therefore, at the advice of his close friend, Cardinal Richard Cushing of Boston, who would for decades be the spiritual advisor for the entire family, Joseph had Rosemary moved to a Catholic community in Jefferson, Wisconsin, then called St. Coletta's School for Exceptional Children, today known simply as St. Coletta's. There, Joseph oversaw the construction of a private home for his daughter on the grounds of the Alverno Nursing Home, a facility that was owned by St. Coletta's, which would become known by the staff as the Kennedy Cottage. It would be here that Rosemary would spend the next 60 years of her life, until her death in 2006 at the age of 86, under the care of the St. Coletta's staff, always in the company of two caretakers from that community, both of them Sisters of the Order of St. Francis of Assisi. It is certainly difficult to believe that Rose Kennedy and the rest of her family were not aware of Rosemary's lobotomy during all of the years that they visited her at St. Coletta's, especially since Rose and Kathleen had once discussed the pros and cons of just such an operation. Could Rose not have put two and two together to figure out what had happened to her daughter? However, the story that's been handed down in the family over the years is that no one knew about the awful operation until well after Joseph was gone. That was in 1969, by the way, when Joe Kennedy died. And some of the family members finally started asking questions. What cannot be disputed is that the Kennedys kept secret the fact that Rosemary was retarded and living in a home, certainly not an unusual thing to hide back in those days. In fact, during JFK's campaign for president in 1960, it was said by the family that Rosemary was off leading a private life as a teacher in a convent in Tarrytown, New York. The first time the public had a clue that something was wrong with her was in the July 1960 issue of Time magazine, when Joseph Kennedy was quoted as saying that she had been suffering from spinal meningitis and convalescing in a Wisconsin nursing home. "I think it's best to bring these things out into the open," he said, even though he was totally lying there. 2 years later, in an essay that Eunice Kennedy Shriver wrote for the Saturday Evening Post in September 1962, she provided a revisionist version of what had actually occurred, with no mention of the lobotomy, of course. She wrote, quote, "In 1941, my mother took Rosemary to psychologists and to dozens of doctors. All of them said her condition would not get better and that she would be far happier in an institution where competition was far less and where our numerous activities would not endanger her health. It fills me with sadness to think that this change might not have been necessary if we'd known then what we know today. My mother found an excellent Catholic institution that specialized in the care of retarded children and adults. Rosemary is there now, living with others of her capacity. She has found peace in a new home where there is no need for keeping up or for brooding over why she can't join in activities as others do. This, coupled with the understanding of the sisters in charge, makes life agreeable for her. Like diabetes, deafness, polio, or any other misfortune, mental retardation can happen in any family. It has happened in the families of the poor and the rich, of governors, senators, Nobel Prize winners, doctors, lawyers, writers, men of genius, presidents of corporations, and the President of the United States. In 1977, Rose Kennedy's secretary, Barbara Gibson, made a startling discovery in the attic of Rose's home. She found Rosemary's leather-bound diaries, going all the way back to the late 1930s, when she was in England with her family while her father was ambassador there. They are fascinating to read in that Rosemary's words paint a vivid picture of a very normal young girl, concerned about her nutrition, her schooling, her interest in fashion and in sporting events, and her social life. Quote, "Have a fitting at 10:15, Elizabeth Arden's," reads one entry. "Appointment, dress fitting again. Home for lunch. Royal tournament in the afternoon." On board the ship, taking the family to England, she wrote, "Up late for breakfast, had it on the deck, played ping-pong with Ralph's sister, also with another man. Had lunch at 1:15, walked with Peggy, Also went to the horse races with her and bet and won $1.50. Went to English movie at 5, had dinner at 8:45, went to the lounge with Miss Cahill and Eunice, and retired early. From Rosemary's writings, she seemed carefree and well-adjusted, not at all troubled. She seemed to have a learning disability. That much is clear from some of the writings in which she writes of trouble in school, and also she seemed dyslexic in her writing, just as Rose had suggested. These diaries, though, were not written by anyone who was severely retarded. They were too concise, too clear, too specific in nature. Rose Kennedy was not happy about their discovery, however. Quote, more than 30 years had passed since her daughter had been institutionalized, and Rose and the rest of the family had long ago settled it in their minds as something they could have done nothing about, observed her secretary, Barbara Gibson. Quote, they didn't even want to think about how things might have been different if Joseph had not acted on his own to solve what he viewed as a problem. Indeed, as far as they were concerned, all of it was just better left in the past. Throw them out, Rose told Gibson of the journals. We don't need them now. Just get rid of them. Barbara Gibson didn't throw them out, though. She kept them. Joseph Patrick Kennedy. What can one make of the fact that Joseph P. Kennedy was so beloved and revered, not only by his own children, but by their spouses as well, despite his responsibility for what happened to his daughter Rosemary? It doesn't overstate it to say that Sergeant Shriver, for instance, hero-worshipped the man, as did Stephen Smith, and the love that Ethel, Joan, and Jackie felt for him was truly boundless. Quote, Dear Grandpa, you brought all the joy into my life, more than one should dare hope to have. And because of all that, all the pain, Jackie Kennedy once wrote in what appeared to be musings jotted down for a possible memoir, the pages ultimately being sold at auction, she wrote, I will remember you, and I will love you until I die. Though Joseph Kennedy could be extremely tough and unyielding, there was a paradoxical loving quality to him that was difficult for his children and their spouses to resist, especially given that Rose Kennedy was by nature so removed or even icy. Not only was she rarely demonstrative, but she also became extremely uncomfortable when anyone around her displayed raw emotion. For instance, even during the darkest of times, when Jackie and Ethel grieved their slain husbands, Rose, by her own admission, would have preferred that they do so in private, not in front of her or any of the other family members. It was Joe Kennedy who openly showed the most love. Tough love, yes, but love just the same. It was Joseph who made the Kennedys feel like they were a family. And so it was he to whom everyone was the most loyal. Admittedly, trying to reconcile Joseph the good father with Joseph the man who did what he did to Rosemary Kennedy presents a conundrum. But grappling with such contradictions is essential when you're trying to understand him. Before setting his sights on politics, he'd made a fortune in the stock market, a huge impact on the film industry in Hollywood, during which time he famously had an affair with Gloria Swanson, the actress. He'd also been ambassador to Great Britain under Franklin Roosevelt, a tenure that ended very badly. And in fact, I'm going to pause right here and encourage you to check out on my channel just last week. I uploaded, we were marking the 80th anniversary of the death of President Franklin D. Roosevelt. And I thought it would be a good time to get into that famous feud between Joseph Kennedy and his president, FDR. That episode is called Joe Kennedy's War with FDR. It's a hell of a story if you weren't aware of it. This all happened right on the eve of World War II, and it was happening concurrently at the same time that Joseph Kennedy is grappling with this decision about what to do with Rosemary and getting that lobotomy performed on her. So it's a fascinating episode. Joseph Kennedy is by far the most interesting of all the Kennedys, whether you love him or hate him. But you should listen to that because it's a really fascinating story, and it's one way to kind of understand him. And I will put a link to that episode of the Kennedy Chronicles in the comments down below. Okay, back to the book. 11 days after Kennedy's arrival in Great Britain, Adolf Hitler's Nazi forces pushed their way into Austria. In a short-sighted assessment of the situation, based on discussions he'd had with Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, Joe Kennedy maintained that the action in Europe had, quote, no long-range implications, quoting Chamberlain as likening Germany to a, quote, boa constrictor that had eaten a great deal and was trying to digest the meal before taking on anything else. This would be the first of many miscalculations for Joe Kennedy. His efforts to promote U.S. isolationism and his continued anti-war stance, it now seems, were based in a large measure on his fear that his 3 older sons, Joe Jr., Jack, and Bobby, would be placed in harm's way, fighting a war that he insisted would be our Armageddon. After making a number of speeches that were at odds with U.S. policy concerning Hitler's aggressive march through Europe, Joseph Kennedy was asked by President FDR for his resignation in 1940. It was Joe's zest for politics and for seeing his sons in powerful government positions that became the focus of his life when he returned from England, in disgrace, I might add. His firstborn, Joseph Patrick Jr., had come 13 months after Joe and Rose's wedding. It was quickly decided by Joseph the Elder that his namesake would be the one who would anchor his dreamed-of political dynasty. 2 years later, future President John F. Kennedy arrived. More children would follow in quick succession over the next 6 years. There was Rosemary, then Kathleen, known as Kick, Eunice, then Pat, Bobby, Jean, and finally another son, Teddy. These children would be brought up with a strict and unflinching code of ethics, determination, and the fiercest of all desires to win. Their dining room would become a lecture hall with constant discussions about current events and politics. I don't think much of people who have it in them to be first, but who finish second, Joseph told his offspring. It was nothing if not a deeply competitive life for all of the young Kennedys. When his son, Joe Jr., was killed in the war in August of 1944, Joe focused on his son, Jack, who, while not as immediately as sharp and charismatic as his brother Joe, was still the best thing the family had going for them, at least as far as Joe was concerned. Joseph Kennedy wheeled and dealed his way into politics, said Time magazine's Hugh Sidey. Maybe buying elections, maybe not, but definitely at the forefront of the family's ascension into high government. None of it would have happened if not for Joseph's dogged determination. The family owed everything to Joseph, to the way he pulled strings for them, the way he supported them financially and emotionally, the way he pushed them when, frankly, they didn't want to be pushed. It was all because of Joseph, said Hugh Sidey. In 1961, Joe Kennedy was felled by a debilitating stroke while golfing at Palm Beach, Florida, leaving him unable to speak or to walk. This was just the beginning of another series of tragedies in the family. In another 2 years, the vibrant young president, JFK, would be assassinated in Dallas. Next would be Teddy's near loss of life in a 1964 airplane crash. Then, before the decade was over, Joseph Kennedy's third son, Bobby Kennedy, would be killed in Los Angeles following a rousing victory speech made after winning the California Democratic primary for 1968's presidential election. Either overlooking the tragedy that had befallen Rosemary Kennedy or chalking it up to Joseph having done the best he could in a difficult situation, the Kennedy family firmly maintained then, as they still do today, that everything they were in terms of strength and resilience was because of the character and example of their patriarch, Joseph P. Kennedy. They would also always acknowledge that their great wealth and political power were the direct result of his hard work and business acumen. Everything they were, in fact, was connected to who he had been in their lives, even their spirituality, for Joe Kennedy was extremely religious and passed on that ideology to his family members, most of whom would also be very devout in their Catholic faith. Everything we have, we owe to Grandpa, is how Ethel Kennedy would put it to her children before a visit to the big house. So when you go in to see him, she would say, and at this time, Joseph Kennedy was an invalid as the result of his stroke, she would tell them, remember that everything you have, every toy, every pet, the house we live in, everything we owe to Grandpa. And that, my friends, is the end of that chapter. Whew, that was a powerful chapter. And very timely right now as we have Joseph Kennedy's grandson, RFK Jr., running the Department of Health and Human Services and making those controversial comments about autism this week. I will let you decide how you feel about that. As a historian, that's really not my place. I'm just here to tell you the history of the Kennedy family, and I will be back next week. Hopefully, I will have another chapter of After Camelot ready next week. It might be a little bit late. I just wanted to tell you that I'm currently working on another project. You know, last Friday, under that executive order that President Trump signed back in January, declassifying and releasing all of these files that have been kept secret for so long on the JFK assassination, the RFK assassination, and the MLK assassinations. As you know, I spent much of last year producing a 13-part investigative true crime series about the RFK assassination. That series is called Who Killed Bobby Kennedy? If you're interested in the RFK assassination, I encourage you to check it out. I've put a link down in the comments if you'd like to watch that series. And I will be back. I'm going to be adding a new episode to that one, episode 14. I have spent much of the last week just going through these 10,000 pages of new, never before seen, in some cases, files on the RFK assassination. And I've found some really interesting stuff in there that I can't wait to share with you. So in the next week or so, I'm going to try to get that episode produced. I'll be uploading that to my channels. So please be sure to subscribe, click the notifications bell, and you'll always be notified when a new episode goes live. And we will be back with another chapter of the Kennedys After Camelot very, very soon. Until then, take care of yourselves. I'll see you soon. I'm Lori Spencer.
Inclusion. It's a simple word, a seemingly simple action. And yet, history is littered with the scars that arise when a society struggles with what it does not understand.
You got to contextualize it. People with developmental differences are forgotten, they're isolated.
Institutions were subhuman locations where people were treated worse than animals. It was front and center, the shame, the humiliation.
For centuries, people with intellectual disabilities were excluded from our social narrative. But through the experiences of the Kennedys, that would profoundly change. The most famous American family of the 20th century was led by Joe Kennedy, a titan of business and a U.S. ambassador. His 9 children would yield war heroes, senators, an ambassador, a champion for social change, an attorney general, and a U.S. president. But they held a secret among them. Eldest daughter Rosemary was born with an intellectual disability. Younger sister Eunice would not let that stop her from forming a bond unlike any other in the family.
The relationship between my mother and Rosemary was the closest. I think she heard her mother and father over the years say to her, include Rosemary, you must include Rosemary. And I think she took that not just as an order, but as a mission.
While the siblings kept Rosemary involved in family events, their father followed the accepted practice of that time. Keep people with intellectual disabilities hidden from view. For Eunice, it was a hurtful mixed message.
My mother, in a special way, learned it from Rosemary and dedicated her life to giving Rosemary the chance in the world that she may never have had otherwise.
To change the worldview of people with intellectual disabilities, Eunice needed a vehicle.
One mother called her and said, there's no camp for my child. And it was at that point that my mother hung up the phone and said, well, yes, there is. The camp's going to be at my house.
And in 1962, at her home in Maryland, Camp Shriver was born.
Her philosophy was that people with intellectual disabilities were as good at sports as anybody else. And when people said that's not true, she said, I'll prove it.
She grew up in a family that loved sports, and I think she saw that through sports you can change the world.
There were 100 volunteers who would come to our house every day, and then there were 100 people with intellectual disabilities who would come.
They were playing in the backyard. They were swimming in a pool. We were running races against them. They're always part of the family.
It was clear that these camps were having an enormous positive effect. So she decided to use the Kennedy Foundation to fund other camps.
For all of the success of Camp Shriver, the public narrative of the Kennedy family continued to exclude Rosemary. So Eunice changed that with an article in the Saturday Evening Post.
On the cover of one of the most widely read magazines in America, she announces that, yes, the President of the United States has a sister he loves who has an intellectual disability. Now let's open the door. Let's all come out.
With inclusion now out in the open, camps across the country continued to flourish. Eunice and her colleagues realized they could expand this well beyond the yard or even the state. And in 1968, at Soldier Field in Chicago, Eunice inaugurated the first Special Olympics.
In ancient Rome, the gladiators went into the arena with these words on their lips: "Let me win, but if I cannot win, let me be brave in the attempt."
Rosemary Kennedy was born at a time when people with intellectual disabilities were hidden away. But a sister's love would shine a light on this social exclusion and show us all what an extraordinary place our world can be when we choose to include.